Hello students, welcome for today's session. The topic for today's session is about the basic concepts of web applications, the working of web applications and HTTP protocol. So we'll watch a video to try to understand the basic concepts. I hope that after watching the video, you will have a clear idea about why you're studying this subject, how the subject is going to be helpful for you in the future. So let's go and check out a video.
So in this video, we are going to look at the basics of web applications or how the web applications work. First of all, let's understand what's called a web application. A web application is a piece of software which can be accessed from a browser. And you know what's called a browser? A browser is an application that you use for browsing the internet. And the examples are your IE or Firefox or Google Chrome or Safari. You all know about that. Technically speaking, we can call a web application a web server, although there is a difference in the sense that a web server can host multiple web applications. But for the time being, let's call a web application a web server. And a web server is actually a network application running on some machine listening on a port. The browser is actually called a web client, or more formally, we call that a user agent. And in fact, web clients are not only browsers, but any application which can speak to a web server, like your CURL or Telnet, those are also web clients or user agents. So the web client or the user agent communicates with the web server to get its job done, and for this communication, and actually for any communication, both the parties need to use the same set of rules or grammar, which we call protocol in technical terms. You got what is called a protocol? It's simple, like when two parties are communicating. For example, when two people are communicating, they need to use the same language and the same set of grammar rules so that they can understand each other. Similarly, in computer science, when two applications are communicating, they need to use the same set of rules, which we call protocol. And the browsers can speak some standard protocols, like the HTTP protocol, the FTP protocol, the WebSocket protocol. There are many protocols which the browsers can speak, and they are standards. And each of these protocols are suitable for different kind of tasks. For example, the FTP protocol is used for transferring files. And among all these protocols, the HTTP protocol is the most used protocol in the web client and the web server club. That means most of the times, the web client and the web server speak to one another using the HTTP protocol. And in fact, in this whole tutorial, we are going to focus only on HTTP protocol. So let's dig somewhat more into the HTTP protocol. To understand HTTP protocol, we need to let's start with what is called a web resource, or a resource as commonly said. A resource is a document, like an HTML document or a PDF document or a JSON document or an XML file or any kind of document which is hosted by a web server, or in other words, a web client can access those documents through a web server. A resource could be either static or dynamic. A resource which does not change is called a static resource. That means it's like some static file sitting in the web server's hard disk or sitting somewhere which the web server has got access to. And when a request for a resource comes from a web client, the web server passes that resource to the web client straight. In contrast, a dynamic resource is generated on the fly, in the sense that when a request for a dynamic resource comes from a web client, the web server builds the resource on the fly. For example, suppose a web server has a resource which embeds the current time, either in a JSON or some XML document or an HTML page or whatever. So when a request for that particular resource comes from a web client, the web server gets the current time from the system and puts that into a JSON document and builds a JSON document or an XML document or an HTML document, embedding that particular time into it, and then it sends back that document to the web client. Each resource on the web in the world is identified by a unique URL, which is actually a unique string. It would be more clear when we look at an example. So this is an example of a URL which points to a unique resource in the world. And this part of the URL is the protocol, and this part identifies the web server in the world, and this is the path of the resource in the web server. We will talk about URL more in some later video. Let's go back to HTTP now. So, HTTP protocol is basically a request response protocol. That means whenever the web client needs to do some operation on a resource, like reading it or updating it or deleting it or creating a new resource or any kind of operation, the web client first establishes a connection with the web server where the resource is hosted, and then the web client sends a request to it. The request contains the details of what the web client wants, like which operation it wants and all. While the web server receives a request, it responds with a response back to the web client. That means it sends a response back to the web client, and the content of the response depends on what was requested. For example, if the client asks to read a resource, the server can either put the resource in the response or inform the client that the resource is not available with me and you go to somewhere else for the resource or something like that. And then after the response is given to the web client, the connection is closed and the web server does not remember anything about the past connections and who the clients were. That means next time if the client sends another request to the server, the web server will treat that request as a new request coming from a new web client, and because of this nature, the HTTP protocol is called a stateless protocol. And this one pair of request and response is called an HTTP transaction. So this was a basic overview of how web servers and web clients work, and in the next video onwards we shall be going deeper on all these.